We welcome everyone to the webinar organized by My CFO, a market leader in the CFO outsourcing industry. The topic of discussion is 3 things a CFO can do to manage investor relations better. We have industry veteran Mr. S. Venkat, co-founder of My CFO, with us to share his knowledge on the same. Mr. Venkat is the founder director of My CFO, India's largest and fastest growing CFO services company. In addition to his other responsibilities, Venkat leads the delivery function at My CFO, where he works with promoters and managements to improve valuations through good practices in the finance and accounts function. Over the last 3 years alone, Venkat has dealt with more than 25 different private equity and venture capital funds who have invested in companies where My CFO plays the CFO role. In addition to this, Venkat is also involved with My CFO clients who are listed in public markets. This experience gives Venkat an unique perspective on an investor's expectations from management in general and from the CFO role in particular. In today's webinar, Venkat will be sharing his insights on how a good CFO can play a critical role in engaging with investors and in helping promoters and managements in managing investor relations. In case there are any questions, they can be asked on the live chat and they will be addressed soon. Over to you, Venkat.
Thank you, Megha, for the words of introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next in the line of My CFO webinars. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. What I thought we would do is to probably go over a very simple PPT that I had, which would take us maybe around 25 minutes or so, following which I thought I'll address the questions that I've got from some of you, which have been emailed to me by Megha. And if during the course of today's webinar, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send it across to Megha through the chat box, and I'll try and address it during the course of the webinar. We should be done by 5 p.m. So we would be possibly on air with this webinar for the next 40 to 50 minutes. So with those few words of introductions, we'll get stuck into the presentation. There are only 4 or 5 slides that I want to share with you. Very broad outlines in terms of what we're going to be covering today. So a business may do a good job, but what every business needs is a CFO who can actually communicate the good performance to the investors, which is really the theme of today as to the need for the CFO to engage with the investing community. The reason why we thought we would do this webinar is obviously a lot of private capital that promoters are now raising, whether it's through equity or through venture capital, and hopefully later this year with the new government, there will be more and more companies that will look to tap the public markets. So the CFO role is going to be quite critical in terms of engaging with these investors and communicating the company performance to them. How does it help the company? So at a very basic level, it helps in management and promoters to access more capital. So a good CFO is not only in touch with his existing investors, but he's also in touch with prospective investors. The other way that it helps a company is to improve valuations. Everything else remaining the same, a company that has got a CFO who's doing a good job of communicating the company performance and articulating the drivers of the business is likely to have a better valuation as compared to a company whose performance is equally good but probably does not have anybody to communicate its performance well. So we'll be covering only 3 topics today as a part of how a CFO can engage better in the investing community. One is the need for us as CFOs to go beyond just the accounting numbers. The second is a need for alignment. Are we all on the same page when we talk about multiple stakeholders like the promoters, the management, other department heads, investors, and the CFO? When we talk about performance metrics, do we all really mean the same thing? The third theme that we'll be talking about is how does a CFO build confidence within the investing community? So I got only one slide for each of these themes. So the first one, we need to go beyond accounting numbers. So several times we find companies that tell us that we close our books once in a year or we close our books once in 3 months. I think in today's time and age, that's simply not good enough. A monthly book closing process that enables the publishing of a monthly MIS has now become an hygiene. Most companies, if they are a fairly basic company with say even Tally as an accounting system, should still be targeting at least the 4th or the 5th of the coming month to publish the MIS. So what do we mean by an MIS? Again, we come across several cases where an MIS is only the profit and loss account. It's very important for a CFO to go beyond and look not just at the profit and loss account, but also at the balance sheet and cash flow, which I believe is again an hygiene issue in terms of the basics that should be made available to promoters and investors as a part of the monthly pack. So somewhere I'm going to make an assumption that the monthly book closing process, as well as publishing an MIS, which includes a P&L, balance sheet and cash flow, is the basic minimum that is happening in your companies. Now beyond that, what is the CFO supposed to be doing? The first thing the CFO should do is to move from effect metrics to cost metrics. Now what do we mean by that? See, end of the day, the bookkeeping function is only an end result of transactions that have already taken place in the business. So it's really a post-mortem of performance of the business at the end of a time period. So while a post-mortem measurement helps a company, what will be even more helpful is if a CFO can actually go out and measure those factors that actually give result to that particular business performance. So what do I mean by that? So it's good for a CFO to say that revenue in this month was X, but is it possible for him to go behind the revenue number and talk about the sales numbers? Because not all your sale will necessarily be revenue in a particular accounting period. Is it possible for him to go one step behind the sale and look at possibly the sales pipeline? How does the sales department in a company view its sales funnel? Is it possible for a CFO to provide assistance in measuring how many prospects or proposals or bids a company is actually sitting on? Is it possible for a CFO to measure what is the age of these proposals? What is the age of these prospects? Is it possible to estimate what is the value that each of these prospects can bring to the table? And is it also possible for a CFO to work with the sales department to estimate what is the probability that we'll be able to win this job for the company? Now, once a CFO moves into measurement of the sales funnel, it then provides a very valuable forward-looking input to the head of the sales department and also to the promoters and investors in a company. So today, it's very important for a CFO to move beyond just the cost metrics in the form of a P&L and look at the causative factors, okay, in the business that give rise to those business results. And therefore, the second bullet is really a corollary of the first, that it's important for a CFO to look at business metrics and not just accounting metrics. So a business metric could be things like employee turnover and how does that impact the business. Is it possible to look at turnaround time when it comes to customer service? Anything that is capable of being measured is something that a CFO should be taking an active interest in. Where we are coming from is that a CFO responsibility is not a reactive responsibility. He's not just the custodian of the company's accounts. Of course he's that, but it's a lot more. He's the person that an investor or a promoter looks at to drive company performance. So unless the CFO has got a pretty good handle on how the other departmental heads are measuring their performance, it will be very hard for the CFO to actually drive the company performance. The other thing that is very important for CFOs to recognize is that, frankly, nobody wants to read Excel sheets. Excel sheets are something that all of us accountants and CFOs love, but most promoters do not have the bandwidth to be able to absorb a lot of numbers. In fact, even with investors, if it's a junior analyst, he would be very happy to have a lot of Excel to crunch. But at a more senior level, what they're looking for is an interpretation of the numbers. And therefore, it's very, very important for a CFO to look beyond just reporting the numbers, but also reporting the interpretation of the numbers. So what are the key messages that an investor or a promoter should be drawing out of an MIS is something that should be called out, as they say, in the MIS report. So the CFO needs to take an active role in quote unquote telling the story. So for a particular month, for a particular quarter, for a particular year, what is it that the company is telling as a story to the investor? When I mean a story, I'm not talking about a fictional story. I'm talking about what are the key messages that it wants to tell to the investor. Was it a good year, bad year? In what respects did we do well? Where we didn't do well? What are the opportunities and risks facing the business? These are the things that the investors want to understand at a fairly high level. So let's move beyond Excel, and there are smart ways to do this. We are now increasingly seeing CFOs presenting not tables in Excel, but graphical representation of the MIS. It's much easier to read the story in the form of a picture rather than having to dive into a set of numbers. Equally, it's important for a CFO to write management commentaries so that you're not only sending out a set of numbers, you're also sending out a write-up that says that, look, this is the way the numbers should be read, and these are the key takeaways from this month of this quarter's MIS plan. Moving on now to the next slide. This is the point regarding alignment. Are we all on the same page? Very often we find that we take for granted that investors, promoters, management, CFO all mean the same when they refer to a particular terminology. But really, it's amazing, 9 out of 10 times when you go and ask somebody a very basic question like what is sales, how do you define sales? And then you could have different people telling you different things. Right? So there could be gross sales, which is before discounts. There could be gross sales including service tax. You could have net sales, that is after excise duty. You could have things like distributor margins, which are sometimes knocked off before the net sales are reported. Sales and revenue could be different in different companies depending what kind of business you are. So let's not make the mistake thinking that terminology is understood in the same way by different companies. When a company embarks on the path of performance measurement, the basic thing it needs to do is to first decide what it wants to measure and how do you define what you want to measure. So documenting simple things like this is a good first step in terms of alignment. This is particularly important when you're engaging with an investor. We all need to recognize that investors are extremely smart financial people, but they are necessarily not involved in the day-to-day operations of your business. So what is obvious to us in terms of sales or turnaround time or an element of cost, an investor, particularly in the first 6 to 12 months of his engagement with you, may not necessarily be on the same page. So you need to take the effort to simplify this so that the way in which you are understanding the company performance and the way in which the investor is understanding the company performance is exactly the same. The CFO alignment, therefore, with the business and the management is a must before you seek alignment with the investors. See, one of the fundamental principles in dealing with investors, and I feel fairly strongly about this, is that if a CFO is doing a good job for the business, there is really no additional work that he needs to do to engage with the investor. The concept of creating something only for the investor, which is not useful to the business, is actually not a right concept. And to be honest, most investors also don't want you to do anything over and above what is good for the business, because ultimately, what is good for the business is good for the promoters, management, and the investors. So, having said this, it's important for a CFO to understand that his first stakeholder, his first internal customer, is really the business. Right? When I say the business, I'm talking about the management, who are the other departmental heads with whom the CFO typically works with, and the promoters, who are the people who have actually started the business. It's very important for the CFO to first seek alignment with them. Right? Again, we make the mistake of thinking that, oh, this must be happening in most companies. But actually, it's surprising that in so many companies, a CFO is not always aligned with business in terms of how to measure performance. So once the first step is established in terms of aligning how we want to do performance measurement with the business, the next step should be to seek alignment with the investors. And finally, I already made this point. What is useful to the investor is always first has got to be useful to the business. If it's not useful to the business, chances are it's not likely to be useful to the investor. So what does the alignment mean in practical terms? So this is a little bit of the how-to of how CFO can go about building an alignment. The first thing we need to do is to agree what we want to measure. Right? In every company, in every budget meeting, in every business plan meeting, there are 1,001 competing priorities, and the spirit is high, optimism is high, people want to do different things, different departments have got different priorities. It's very important for a CFO to sift through all of this and say that, look, if these are the 5 output metrics or the effect metrics that we're really after, then what are the 10 positive metrics that I really need to measure and stay on top of? So let us take an example. So if it's a company that is now struggling with cash flow, highly leveraged, most of their cash profits being drained out through interest, a company could be saying as a part of its one-year budgeting process that for me, reduction of working capital and freeing up free cash is an important objective. So freeing up the cash is an effect metric that a CFO can agree with the business. Now, CFO will go back and say, what can I do? What are the causative factors I need to track? So you could say, okay, I want to now monitor what is my working capital blockage. Now, a discussion of this nature, while I'm making it sound extremely simplistic, you've got to make a choice, and that is a difficult part, right? I mean, theoretically, most CFOs know that, okay, these are the 100 things that drive my business. But in terms of sensitivity of those factors to your business, it's very important for a CFO to be able to distill the causative factors and say that, okay, these are the 10 or 15 factors that are so critical for me that I want to stay on top of this. So the first point in taking alignment with the investors is to be on the same page with them as well as the business in terms of agreeing what are the effect metrics and the causative metrics that I want to measure. The other thing that we need to do, which I've covered a little bit earlier, is defining what we mean by every metric. It's very important to document this so that there is clarity on the table. The next thing that we need to do, and this is kind of curiously not aligned in many companies, is that the budget is expressed in a certain metric, whereas the actual is not measured as per the same definition. Now this could be in 2 ways. One could be that the metric itself is different. The second thing could be that the metric is defined at a level of granularity which is different from what is there in the budget, right? So again, let me give you an example of how this tends to be a problem in several companies. When you do the budget, you could be defining sales along multiple dimensions. You could be having sales by customer, you could be having sales by geography, you could be having sales by channel, you could be having sales by product. It's possible to slice and dice for sales in multiple ways. And this is a good exercise to do as a part of the budgeting process. But when we move on to the actuals, what you find is all you're able to measure is gross sales or net sales at a company level. Now, in many companies, a cause of frustration with the finance department is that expectations are raised during the budgeting process, where given the slice and dice that is possible, an investor and a promoter will think that, hey, look, it's great, the quality of the budget is great. The presumption is that the CFO has got the capability and the ability to measure the actuals against this budget, which is several times not necessarily the case. So during these conversations, it's important to also align expectations of investors and business to say that, look, although we are budgeting or planning our business on these dimensions and on the slice and dice we're doing on the budget axis, when it comes to the actual axis, it is quite possible that you may not be able to get the actual information against the budget, at least not in the first 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months into the year, right? it's important for the CFO to manage expectations, right? Because like everybody else, investors thrive on data and they love to have data to analyze, and the expectation will always be that the CFO is able to deliver the data at the required level of granularity. Now that's a good goal, I think, for a CFO to aspire to, but it also depends on where the company is in terms of its maturity cycle with regard to performance measurement. So if you don't have timely data entry, if you don't have a good IT system that allows you to pull out the information, if the data entry has not been captured along the dimensions that it should be captured, a CFO's ability to deliver good quality granular business intelligence is going to be severely limited. Now we need to get to that point, but this is a process, and in many companies it could take anywhere between 6 months and 18 months to get to that point. It is therefore important, I think, for the CFO to align the expectations of the investors to the plan that he is having in mind to deliver the MIS at the right level of detail. So which is the last point that I was talking about, which is to agree the pace and the direction that we will take in order to get to the end result. It's important for CFOs not to be too hard on ourselves sometimes, because getting to super detailed metrics that investors sometimes require will take time, right? So as long as it's communicated to them and they are in agreement, presumably, with your time estimate on how long it will take you, you should be fine, right? But every company needs to aspire to get to that level of granularity, because better granular information is not just a happy investor. It also means that you're providing your business a better handle with which to steer the business. Moving on to the last theme, which is how do we build confidence with investors? The problem is usually never the problem. It's not knowing the dimensions of the problem which is the problem. We have had several questions that came to us as a part of this webinar to say that how do I manage investor relations in a scenario where my company performance is not good, or some of the warranties that I made to my investor in terms of how the business will actually progress has not panned out in practice. Now let us look at it from an investor standpoint, right? Every investor would obviously like to see a company, like to see an industry company that is performing well. But we also need to recognize that investors are used to a portfolio of companies, and not every company's performance is equally good or equally bad. So they are used to seeing a range of performances. An investor, therefore, is never rattled by seeing a problem. It's something that they would have seen in some of their other industry companies, and they recognize that there are operational realities that you might have not foreseen at the time when they put money in your company. This is a practical business problem. It's not necessarily a promoter creation. You just recognize this. The issue that most investors have is that they are told about the problem too late, or they are given a certain impression of the problem without being given the specific dimensions of the issue. So one is to understand the nature of the problem, and second is to understand the magnitude of the problem. It's important for CFOs to take a lead in this. Very often we find that promoters, although they have got an excellent grip of the business issues on the ground, they may not be able to express their understanding of the problem in a form or a language that an investor expects or an investor understands. They may be able to state the problem, but they may not be able to quantify the impact. They may be able to give you 3 or 4 or 5 expected solutions on how to come out of the problem, but they may not be made in terms of putting together the pros and cons of what is the best way to come out of the problem. Now, these are the places where a CFO is uniquely placed. The CFO has got an advantage because he wears a business hat. End of the day, he's a confidant of the CEO or the promoter, so he understands what are the business issues. Equally, he's a numbers guy like the investor. So if there is one person in the company who needs to take on this role proactively, of communicating the problem to the investor, it's got to be the CFO. Very often, a CFO has got a problem. He may not know how much the problem to communicate to the investor, because promoters usually have a view on this. I think it's a typical issue on the ground. Every CFO faces this. Every promoter wants to be transparent, but end of the day, every promoter also thinks that there are some parts of the company's operations that is possibly best not revealed to the investor. In these cases, it's important for the CFO to work with the promoter. We need to understand that an investor, once he has put money into your company, in 99 out of 100% of the cases, is most likely to view the problem through the same lens as what the promoter does. The cost of not taking an investor into confidence at the right time can be huge, because it causes a loss of something which is very rarely recovered, which is trust. The CFO therefore has to work with the promoter and encourage the promoter to do what is right, which is, you don't need to be a doomsday prophet, you don't need to overreact to a business problem, but an objective, data-driven definition of the problem. It's important for the CFO to tell the promoter that, look, let's go and communicate this issue to the investor. If it's not a problem, or you're not sure whether something is going to be a problem, still it doesn't matter. It's good to flag it to the investor and say, hey, look, this metric is not looking good. I'm not quite sure if this is going to be a problem in the future, but I wanted you to know that this may be a problem. Investors really appreciate that. What they want to know is the bad news, right? The good news and the 30% IRR, they'll be happy to take. The problem is that they want to know what are the risks that will come in the way of making those kind of returns. And if they don't understand the risks, they tend to get very, very jittery. Which brings us to the second point on building confidence, which is that transparency is a non-negotiable item. It's very, very important that ultimately the role of an investor is that of a partner in the business. And we've got to understand one thing, that because they are not people from the business usually, they are placing a huge amount of reliance on the CFO to tell them what is going on, right? So it's important for the CFO to be guided by his own conscience in terms of transparency and being open to the investor. And this can be done in multiple ways. It's important for a CFO to reach out to the investor, not only during the quarterly board meetings, but sharing proactively the monthly MIS and also sharing with them even weekly sales reports. I have seen very few investors who have said, look, don't share data with me, I've got enough data. I mean, I'm yet to hear an investor who's saying that. We have investors always complaining that the CFO is not doing enough in terms of providing timely or correct data to us. So transparency is something that a CFO, that's completely a part of the CFO's role to make sure that the performance is communicated transparently to the investor. We already covered the third bullet. So see the investor as someone who is on the same side of the table as what you are. The fourth bullet has got to do with the timeliness of MIS, which again is a classic problem that all of us face. No good accountant likes to release an MIS which has got an estimate in it, right? He would always like to have a hard number which he's 100% confident about. Sadly, most accountants are also not able to generate this within a reasonable time frame after the month end. It is far better to have a 98% correct MIS with 100% accuracy on the messages and the takeaways of that MIS within say 3 days of the month end, rather than waiting for a 100% correct MIS to emerge say 10 days after the month end. MIS is like food. It's not packaged food, it's like fresh food. It is good when it is consumed immediately. The more you delay delivery of the food, the bigger smell it's going to have. And this is a classic problem we find. A CFO has got to use his judgment on when the MIS should be going out to the investors. Always early. It's do not look for 100% accuracy. You've got to be sure of the underlying credibility of the numbers. I mean, I'm not making a point here for speed over accuracy, All I'm saying is it is speed given a minimum degree of accuracy. That is an absolute must for the CFO to be able to do. The next point is on consistency. Nothing frustrates an investor more than getting a report on time for a certain month and then not getting it at all or getting it with significant delays. Consistency is a good quality to have in a CFO. It also makes you more predictable as far as the investor is concerned. An investor wants to know, he wants to define who is this personality that I'm dealing with. Inconsistency in delivery of reports leads them to believe that the CFO is not on top of his job, which is probably the truth. But if that is not the fact, then it's important for you as a CFO to get whatever reports you're getting out, get it out on time on a consistent basis. Certainty in terms of information flow, certainty in terms of providing face time helps in building confidence with the investors. The other thing that's very important, again, it's kind of basic courtesy, is a lot of times investors reach out saying that they need certain information. Now this could usually be for their investment committees, it could be for their partners. Most of them have got their own templates. They may come back to you on a monthly or a quarterly basis, at least telling you to kind of fill up information in a particular format. Or there could be discussions in the board meeting where maybe you do not have full information on hand and they make a request saying that, look, can you please go out and get this information for me? It's very important for the CFO to actually carry out those requests. Again, it's just good manners, basic courtesy, but investors feel happy when they know that they're taken seriously, right? Again, this is completely a part of the CFO's role to proactively respond to these requests and preferably do it within a short time frame at the end of the meeting so that the investors have the confidence that you're on top of the game. So that's basically what I had in terms of the presentation. We do have a few questions that that have been sent across to us. So one question is how to manage investor expectations if the expected return on investment are lower than the one projected earlier. Further, what type of MIS reports are usually expected by investors and at what frequency? So let me take the first question first. How to manage investors' expectations if expected ROI are lower than the one projected earlier? So this is a common problem, okay? So if it's of any consolation to the person who asked the question, you're not the only person in this boat. There are several other companies where the return on investment is probably lower as compared to what you yourself projected earlier at the time of raising funds. I think the best way out is an honest chat. No investor, like any other common man, likes to hear adverse news. But I think investors as a class tend to recover from bad news much faster than other types of people. It's best to have a sit out with them and thrash this out. I don't see lower ROIs per se to be a problem. A larger problem is when there is consistent under-delivery, underperformance, and that is a serious issue. So several times you make quarterly projections and you failed, let's say the business failed to achieve the quarterly targets, and you go out, you explain the poor performance and tell them, you know what, the next quarter is going to be like this. And the next quarter again you fail to achieve the performance. Now, repeated failure over a period of time is a cause of concern, not just because of poor business performance, it's also because there's now a credibility issue. They don't know whether they can trust your judgment anymore or not. So what kind of business or what kind of CFO is this who goes into meetings repeatedly, explains or articulates a certain trajectory that the business is going to work on, and then repeatedly go back to the same set of people saying that, you know what, I got my projections wrong or I got my assumptions wrong. Investors are really worried about that because they have invested money, end of the day, taking a call in large part on the people behind the business. Now, if people behind the business can't read the trends in the business correctly, then an investor is asking the question, is my money safe? So it's very important, and if this is happening, to whoever has asked the question, if this is happening consistently at your company, then you got to go back and hold your business people accountable. Because a lot of times what we find is that projections are made based on assumptions that are given by, say, salespeople or production people, or marketing people, and so on. Very rarely are projections manufactured in a CFO's end-to-end. The CFO could be putting numbers around it, but the fundamental assumptions come from the business. It's very important for a CFO to hold the business accountable for the projections that they're giving you. Because end of the day, if they keep getting it wrong, it's going to be your credibility that is going to suffer with the investor, which I'm sure you don't want it happening. So improved communication with the business, improving their capability to make logical projections, probably some training input to be given to them, maybe a more frequent tracking of the assumptions that they're giving you so that they kind of understand how to use judgment better. Some of these things are tips that you could potentially use at your company to make sure that the projections that you give to your investors are not off target. The second part of the question is, what type of MIS reports are usually expected by investors and at what frequency? So as I mentioned earlier, a P&L, balance sheet and cash flow is a bare minimum that any investor would expect. Every investor would also expect that there would be adequate analysis of the numbers and not just data that is getting thrown out to them. Beyond this, it's hard to provide a standard list of what investors expect. It really depends on where they are in terms of the investment cycle at your company. So if it's a new investment, chances are that they're going to be asking for all sorts of reports because they're also trying to understand the business a little better. If they are slightly older in your company, then they would have figured out as to what are the critical factors that they absolutely need to track, in which case they'll come back and tell you that, look, this is what I need in my report. So I would imagine that the kind of reports beyond a certain minimum would be highly tailor-made, depending on what kind of investor you're dealing with and where they are in the investment cycle with you. But a P&L, balance sheet, cash flow, not only the actuals but also actuals versus budget, and a forecast of where you're likely to end the year is something that every investor would look at as a bare minimum. I have one more question here, which is from a CEO. He asks, what are the ways to go for CFOs in new and growing small companies? Okay, so I'm assuming that the question here is about how a CFO of a new or growing small company can engage with investors. So I think it's important for the CFO to be active not just with existing investors, but also with prospective investors. So your company could have already got an investment from a fund, but it's helpful for you to kind of stay in touch with other funds as well. You never know. In case your company does not have external funding, and the promoter is very keen to obtain external funding for furthering the growth, business growth of the company, then there is really no option. I mean, you would need to go out and engage in the market and talk to potential investors. There are two ways to try and do this. One is to reach out through investment bankers, where they bring the relationships on the table, and there are some pluses and minuses to engaging in investment bankers. The other thing you could do is to reach out directly to investors. From our experience, there is absolutely no problem in reaching out directly. Most investors are happy to engage with you. What I find important in these conversations is that you need to go prepared. So even if you're testing the waters, even if you're in the market, not immediately raise funds, but you kind of have a long-term plan for 12 months, 24 months, whatever you do in the market has got to be well thought out, well researched, and well presented. You never know when a prospective investor will become a real investor in your company. And confidence building does not just start after they put money. It's a step-by-step process. So if you are in the market looking to raise funds, then our input would be that engage early. talk to multiple people, see what is the best deal that you're likely to get in the market, and stay in touch with people consistently. Even if you decide not to take money from anyone, it's important for you to go back and explain why you're not doing it. Investors appreciate your rewards in terms of when you decide to take or not take money. Yeah, but regular and timely communication is something important for a CFO to do. Okay, there is one more question that we have. This is from a co-founder of a sports company asking us more about measurement of business performance and its alignment with investors. I think we kind of covered this during the course of the presentation. But as I was explaining earlier, it's important for the CFO and the investors to mutually agree on a set of metrics that they're going to be tracking to measure the business. And this set of metrics could actually change. I mean, there's nothing cast in stone. It could change maybe every 6 months. But changing it more frequently is also an issue. It just means that we haven't thought through very clearly as to how we want to measure the business. So engage. I mean, before we actually get down to the task of measuring, our input is engage with the investors, talk to them, take them around, get them familiar with your business, and sit down and agree with them, saying that, look, over the next 6 months, this is the way in which we are going to be reporting the numbers to you. What is your view? Are you happy with this? Are there formats or are there templates or are there best practices that you have seen in some of your other investee companies that you would like to share with us? If they are willing to share with you, that's great. In fact, most investors are very happy because this is non-sensitive. They wouldn't really have a problem in sharing this. So these are ways in which you kind of co-opt them as a part of the solution. So, typically when we look at what investors want out of us, we see it as a problem, right? We say, oh, they want so much data. But equally, if you start thinking of them in terms of how they can be part of the solution, that can be pretty powerful as well. End of the day, I mean, they play a role similar to management consultants. Like management consultants who've got multiple clients, investors have got multiple investees, and they carry a lot of learnings from them, which are cross-industry. So no harm in leveraging that. Yeah. So I guess the answer to this question is, more regular communication with the investors to kind of figure out, how they see the business and how they want to measure it, and whether that makes sense for you from a business angle. Right. So that's the set of questions that I have at this point. So I'm not sure if there are any other questions that any of the attendees of the webinar had. If there are, we'd be very happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Venkat, for the insightful details. I thank everyone for participating. As Venkat mentioned, if there are any further queries, I'm sure everybody must have taken the email IDs as part of the last slide. They can be mailed either to Venkat or Deepak, and they will be answered soon. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you so much, Venkat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.